Welcome everyone to Globus Books virtual living room. Today we are greeting you from Belgium, more specifically Flanders. We are traveling around the world, but we are located in San Francisco. So if you are in that part of the world, do not hesitate to visit us. And today I am really excited to greet Jose Vergara with his new book, All Future Plunges to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature. So this book is published by Cornell University Press just this year, and I will be introducing all the wonderful participants for today and telling you a little bit more about Globus Books in San Francisco. And then we will start on the wonderful exploration of this book, which is a journey by itself. Congratulations, Jose. Jose is assistant professor of Russian at Bryn Mawr College. He specializes in prose of the long 20th century with an emphasis on experimental work. His first book, All Future Plunges to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature, examines Russian writers' reception of Joyce's fiction. It illuminates how they have used Joyce's ideas as a critical lens to shape, prod, and constantly redefine their own place in literary history. He has published on authors including Vladimir Nabokov, Mikhail Shishkin, and Sasha Sokolov, among others, in a variety of journals, and his writing and interviews can also be found in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Asymptote, Words Without Borders, and Music and Literature. He is now at work on a project dealing with contemporary Russian prison writing. We are also excited to welcome Alexei Salnikov, poet and writer, whose books are very popular at Globus Books and elsewhere in the world. And Alexei was born in Tartu and lives in Yekaterinburg, and I believe he's joining us today from there. He's the author of 3 acclaimed novels, The Department, The Petrovs in and Around the Flu, and Indirectly. The Petrovs won the National Bestseller Prize in 2018 and the North Awards Critics Prize in 2019. Indirectly was a Big Book Award finalist. Celebrated director Kirill Serebrennikov recently adapted Salnikov's second novel. The film had its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival under the name Petrov's Flu. And also today we are joined by a fellow literary podcaster and channel host and a philologist and translator, Armen Zakharyan, who is based in Warsaw. Armen graduated from the Philological Department of the People's Friendship University of Russia and studied literary theory and criticism at Oxford University and translation theory at St. Petersburg State University and Cardiff University. He is the creator of the popular literary YouTube channel and podcast, which is called, interestingly, Armen and Fodor, which I believe one of the allusions is Maxim and Fodor, and we'll talk about it a bit later. And this channel won the Russian Podcast Award in 2019 and Blog Post Award in 2020. He is also the creator of the Joyce Project, a large-scale literary project in which several thousand participants read and discussed each chapter of Joyce's novel Ulysses for 18 consecutive weeks. And on our website and the Facebook event, you can find the link to the channel. Now a little bit more about Globus Books, which is an independent bookstore serving San Francisco since 1971, one of the oldest Russian language Russophone literature bookstore in the United States. It offers a wide-ranging stock of books on all things Russia, actively working with the libraries across the states. We specialize in antique books, voyage books, and Globus Books team team is very well known for its expertise in first editions of Russian literature and books on the Russian avant-garde, early imprints, you name it, Globus Books has it. Located in San Francisco at Balboa Street, next to a wonderful bakery. So again, if you're there, please visit us. We also sell books online. Check out www.globusbooks.com. You are probably watching us currently at Globus Books YouTube channel that is relatively new, started in the beginning of pandemics, and we feature several series of literary and cultural events. Please subscribe. We are presenting literary translation roundtables, history and anthropology, playtime and story time for children. I'm Zarina Zabriskie. I'm an author of 3 short story collections and a novel, and I'm the producer and hostess of this channel. So welcome. This talk is promising to be epic. And to rephrase Nabokov, who is a part of the conversation today, the main character here is not Joyce, but Russian literature through the prism of Joyce. In Jose's remarkable book, we will follow Russian and Soviet writers in Joyce's footsteps in borrowed shoes that sometimes are too small and constrict the movements. But it is a really fun journey in search of lost, misplaced keys. I am almost done with it. I'm 2 chapters before finishing it, and I can't wait to ask Jose my questions and have you joining me and asking questions to Jose, Armen, and Alexei. So, Jose, in all future plunges to the past, you deal with not just one, but a number of subjects: intertextuality, paternity as literary tradition, and literary tradition as paternity, time, Russian literature's position on the world stage, at home and in exile. First of all, congratulations, and let's hear from you greeting our public today.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending or watching in the future, which is all appropriate to the title, right? You're watching us in the future and returning to this past. And I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for attending here live, and then also definitely to Globus and Zarina for hosting. It's a real delight, and I've been a fan of the shows this past year.
Thank you, Jose, and we are very, very happy to have you. So let me ask you the first question on one of the main themes in all future plunges into the past, and it is intertextuality. In your book, it's sort of a Napoleon cake turned sideways and horizontally. We are confronted with literature as a mix of voices, a universe in which the ideas can be drawn from the air, and the river of the novel that one can't enter twice in the same place. It is this busy family with pre-modernist grandparents that go all the way back to the 19th century, and parents, modernist parents of the 20th century, postmodernists of the 21st. You quote in the foreword Kristeva's definition of intertextuality. Let me read it here. The process by which authors insert themselves into other texts within a historical or social context. She aims to define the specificity of different textual arrangements by placing them within the general text or culture of which they are a part, and which is in turn part of them. So my question, in this context, you mentioned both vertical and horizontal lines of contact between Joyce and Russian writers. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is along the lines of what you were describing and quoting. It was really important to me to situate each of these writers, the 5 primary case studies of the book, Lyesha, Nabokov, Bitov, Sokolov, and Shishkin, within their context, and in this way to demonstrate, to show and highlight how each version of Joyce that they're reading and responding to is different depending on their circumstances. There's not one single great monolithic Joyce. It's a different Joyce that they're rediscovering based on where and when they're writing and responding to Joyce. So the Joyce that Alyosha encountered at the beginning of the Soviet era is much different than the one that Bitov or other writers of his generation would read after Stalin's death, and later when new translations and new access became possible. There's these different Joyces and different ways to relate to Joyce and to respond to him along the way. That's kind of the broader picture. And then with each individual case, in the first two with Alyosha and Nabokov, I do think that they kind of subscribe to this idea of intertextuality and literary lineages, heritages, as being more vertical, I suppose, top down, this kind of conflict with past writers and father figures in literature. But then as we move forward to writers such as Sokolov and Shishkin and Bitov, even in the mid-century, they're taking a different view of Joyce and recognizing that they're not reading him when he was first published, that he had been suppressed for so long, and they have to encounter him in a whole new way. And they have to, I guess, kind of come to terms with that and recognize that the past doesn't have to be something that you war with. It doesn't have to be the nightmare of Stephen Dedalus. And you can approach it more playfully, I suppose, and take little bits here and there to create something new of your own without that anxiety that comes up in Alyosha and in Nabokov to some extent.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be jumping between our three speakers today. And what you said just brought to mind one of the questions that we had for Alexei. Alexei, was it strange for you to encounter Joyce and all the other band writers all of a sudden in 1990s, as Jose just mentioned, happened to many of us?
Понимаете, в тот момент, когда я достиг сознательного возраста, Джойс и остальные писатели перестали уже быть запретными. Вот.
You know, when I reached the conscious age as Alexei, Joyce and other band artists and writers were not banned anymore. That's what happened.
И я просто получал впечатление от литературы так, как будто она, собственно, такой всегда и была. Вот.
I had my impressions from literature as if it always was like this.
Нам даже на внеклассное чтение, ну вот на чтение между одним учебным годом и другим, в подростковом возрасте в 15-14 лет задали прочитать Лимонова, например.
Just to give you an example, when we were 14 or 15 for our extracurricular reading, summer reading, we had an assignment to read Eduard Limonov, who's certainly not the Soviet realist, just for those who are not familiar with that. Да?
Но в любом случае столкновение с Джойсом было, ну, впечатляло очень сильно, потому что это было как продолжение. Значит, так получилось, что сначала я познакомился с Набоковым все-таки.
Of course, the encounter with Joyce was very impressive. And it happened so that first I started to read Nabokov.
Вот. И так получилось, что я встретил Джойса и почувствовал вот это продолжение ощущения, продолжение чувства, что жизнь — это и есть некое продолжение, что ли, литературы, или насколько почувствовал, насколько литература вплетена в жизнь, насколько речь нами управляет.
And when I started to read Joyce, I had the same feeling, I believe, as when I was reading Nabokov, how much life is interweaved with literature and literature is interweaved with life, and how much the speech, the language is important and guides our life.
Поэтому у меня до сих пор сохраняется, поскольку это произошло в детстве, в юности, у меня до сих пор есть ощущение от жизни, как от такой части все-таки игры. Серьезной, да, бывает такой, в которой нельзя ничего исправить, но все равно игры.
So I still have this feeling that I got then as a teenager, that life is in a certain extent a game, a literary game. The answers and questions kind of interweave, just like literature and life. Intertextuality is one of the main dish here in your book. And another main key topic is predominant, is the paternity as a literary tradition, fatherhood, biological and literary. And one of the major subjects is the continuity of the literary process and the issue of literary successor and predecessors, or fathers, sons, and holy ghosts of the greats. So for Stephen Dedalus, the goal was to shed the burden of literary tradition, to kind of sum it up, and to father his own art. You're right, in Stephen's interpretation of Hamlet, the artist, Shakespeare, becomes a father to himself by producing genuine art, Hamlet, and a ghost by playing a role, Shakespeare as the ghost of Hamlet's father in a production of the play. Disillusioned with the past, he may refashion it through creativity. As we weave and unweave our bodies, Stephen said, from day to day, their molecules shuttle to and fro. So does the artist weave and unweave his image. By adopting a literary father figure who demands no loyalty to legacy and traditions, rewriting personal history and creating lasting art, gifted writers may inscribe themselves into world literature and be liberated of all servile filial bonds. So can you speak of Stephen's Shakespeare theory as it applies to the key themes of your books and to the authors, Russian authors, in your book?
Yeah, so this is a kind of guiding thread or main narrative thread throughout the book. So I was saying before, each of the case studies represents a kind of different intertextuality or different approach to intertextuality, a different moment in time in Russian literature seen through the prism of Joyce. Then what unites them all, what does kind of bring unity to all of this, is this idea that Joyce has his hero Stephen in Ulysses Express in episode 9 in the library, as you quoted me as you were describing, that the creative artist, the writer, can become a father to himself in this case by creating art that thus defines how the world will see you in posterity. It becomes who the figure, the writer that you're always remembered as. And you birth yourself in that way. I think all of the writers that I'm looking at were fascinated, obsessed, fixated on this idea of paternity in different ways. And they, in different ways, turn to the Shakespeare theory, Joyce's Shakespeare theory through their works. So we take someone like Yuri Alyosha in the early Soviet era, who's very much pulled between this individualist approach that Joyce represents, this modernist individualist approach that kind of demands or calls upon the artist to look upon the world with their unique perspective on the one hand, and on the other, the kind of drive toward conformity, or at least toward the new Soviet way of life, the new Soviet person, man in the Soviet Union, who's pulled between these two. So I see Envy, Alyosha's novel, which was published in 1927, a couple of years after the first partial translation of Ulysses in the Soviet Union, as a kind of response to this idea, or working through of these ideas that Joyce laid out. Because his hero too feels this call to the West, to individualist art, to experimentation in art, all the things that Joyce and Stephen kind of champion. But he's unable to, both for personal reasons, this kind of ambivalence that he feels, that he can't commit to charting his own path, but then also the kind of social, political conditions around him prevent him in doing so, to do so. And there's all these, this was really the starting point for the book, these strange, or to me, surprising when I first encountered them, connections between the two books, between Ulysses and Envy Zavist. The bathroom scenes, these naturalistic moments, how they both end with the characters in bed, certain characters being described in similar ways, all these sorts of things strike me as a kind of commentary on Alyosha's part on Ulysses and Joyce's idea. So that's how it kind of operates there. Then, just to give another example, in Bytov's Pushkin House, Pushkinsky Dom, he's writing exactly about this. His hero Lyova develops what he calls the grandfather hypothesis, or the alternative grandfather hypothesis. He's really thinking about how to cut out the biological from his life, from his experience, and select a new father or grandfather to kind of change history in a way. Bytov explicitly mentions Joyce and Finnegan's Wake and Portrait of an Artist in this book, Pushkin House. So he's clearly engaging with Joyce, or the myth of Joyce, and the ideas in Joyce's text. Ultimately, where he comes down is that you can't compete with the past. A lot of the book is about how his generation has come to Joyce belatedly. He doesn't feel the kind of freedom that Alexei feels about Joyce in literature, but feels kind of overwhelmed and thinking that he's competing with the past that he can never catch up with. But by the end, sort of accepts this and just chooses bits and pieces of Joyce and modernism and history to decorate and play with and create something new, instead of challenging and arguing with a paternity that you can't really change.
Thank you. And it is one of the main themes again, and we'll get back to Alyosha because it's really fascinating. I really enjoyed reading this chapter. But before we do that, I would like to ask Armen a similar question. Armen, I watched 7 episodes of your Ulysses coverage. I loved it. They're succinct, right on top. They don't oversimplify it, which I was afraid might happen. Absolutely not. The reading very careful, well thought, tactful reading, which I appreciated a lot. And of course, you start with the first chapter after the introduction with the same theme and Stephen Shakespeare's theory, and the whole theme of Russian has these good words that I wasn't able to find. Some of them, good ones in English, отцеискательство, the search for the father. Somebody, if you have one word for it, you tell me, but it's one word that literally says father seeking. So you talk about that, and again, Hamlet's ghost. Can you please also add to that from your point of view?
Sure. First of all, thank you for kind words that you said. Jose, I want to congratulate you on the book. And thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today with you. So considering your question, I believe I can just agree with what Jose just said, because you really can't compete with the past, but what you can do, you can use that past to create something new, considering the past that has been. So in terms of the famous 9th chapter from the library, I would like to maybe give it a new perspective, a perspective of a common reader, because a lot of people who took that challenge that we started this year, the Joyce Project challenge, and a lot of people who started reading Ulysses they confessed after that that the 9th chapter was the most hard for them until, let's say, the 14th, which is obviously very hard, the Oxen of the Sun, or the 15th, which is also hard. But from the first part of the book, the 9th chapter was like a Rubicon, if I can say, that not so many readers could cross. So there's something in that chapter that is trying to like challenge you. And if you pass, you yourself reading the book, if you pass this competition, yeah, Stephen starts this chapter thinking about the competition, the verbal competition and intellectual competition in his case, the competition that he engages in. So the reader does the same. When he reads that chapter, he has to pass a certain test, which is very difficult to pass, and Joyce didn't make it easy. So I think that yeah, this is an important feature of this chapter, that it's more or less in the middle of the book in terms of let's say the number of the chapters, and it really has something special in it that works as a final test for the reader if he is really eager to read this book, and if he's ready to be challenged and intellectually challenged, and in all other kind of ways as well. I don't know if I could answer your question but I tried.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Not only you answered the question, but you provided the little bridge and transition to my next question to Jose, and perhaps to you and to Alexei and to everybody else. And my strong sense from reading Jose's books and all the books that he's basing his book on is what Jose quotes Harold Bloom as calling as anxiety of influence, or in your words, Armen, the sense of competition. It's very strong in all 6 books we are talking about. And it's very strong in the analysis of the books by Jose. So as the 5 authors face their anxieties of influence, the sense of needing to overcome one's predecessors, and Harold Bloom referred to it as Oedipal literary complex, actually. In your book, we are following this never-ending competition. So it's, if you think about it, it's Joyce versus Homer, Joyce versus Shakespeare, Russian writers, Nabokov, Alesha, Sokolov, Bitov, Shishkin, versus and against Joyce, Pushkin, and Shakespeare. And then there come the whole pleiad of all the other Russian writers, like in Pushkin house. And Jose, you write that metafictionally, Joyce announces his status as a new Shakespeare or Homer. So what is it? Is it this literary transgenerational transition, some sort of clash of literary titans, or a race in which no writers will ever catch up with Joyce, and Joyce will never catch up with Homer? And you mentioned Zeno's paradox, in which Achilles never catches the tortoise. So what do you think? What is your take on this competition?
I think depending on how you look at it, everyone's a winner or everyone's a loser in this battle. But I think, you know, what I'm saying in the book or suggesting kind of to reiterate, it's so context specific. So it's all of these things. It's a clash, it's a race, it's a sort of acceptance and moving forward to create something new. As I was saying, Alyosha and Nabokov, I think, felt this kind of tension and competition much more strongly than the later writers, partly because of the sort of modernist hierarchy that they were operating in and adhering to. Nabokov, and maybe we can get to this a little bit later too, actually reached out to Joyce to translate Ulysses in 1933. It didn't happen, unfortunately, but he was very aware of Joyce, met him personally, had a kind of, great respect for him, but the way he writes about him is the way he writes about, any other writer. He can like certain things, but is very much in competition with him and wants to one-up him in certain ways. And that's why in chapter 2 of the book, I also look at his second English language novel, Ben Sinister, and examine how he kind of continues the conversation with Joyce, incorporating this parody of the library scene in Ulysses, and kind of exaggerating what Joyce is doing there. And I think about why. And in that case, right, he's situating himself in a new language, in English, as an English language writer. So his competition, or his, role model is no longer Pushkin and the great classic Russian writers, but now it's Joyce and Shakespeare, and he has to engage with them directly. Then for the others, Bitov, right, again, it's this question of belatedness, but then when we get to Sokolov and Shishkin, I think things get, even more intriguing in a way. In Sokolov, so much of it, with the exception of Polysandria, Astrophobia, his final novel, really seems like intentionally apolitical. He doesn't want to engage with questions of history in any traditional way anyway. And the goal there is to sort of accept all the predecessors and all the possible literary figures around him as kind of equal, and he can just pull and play with art and focus on the words themselves instead of anything beyond that. It kind of tempers the drive to compete with the past in that way. And Shishkin, what I propose here, based on also what he's written outside of the novel that I look at, Maidenhair, is that for him, Joyce is a kind of lever, or some sort of device, right, that he can pry open world literature, this literature that Russia hadn't been a part of for so long during the Soviet era, and insert himself and insert his version of Russian literature back on the world stage. Joyce is the means for him of doing so by engaging with Joyce's ideas, by kind of reproducing or adapting and modifying the modernist devices and modernist worldview of Joyce, a more kind of cosmopolitan and not strictly nationalist view that one can find in Russia at times today. That's the opposite of what Shishkin is after. So yeah, in short, I think it's all of those things, and that's what makes it so rich, that there isn't one single Joyce, as I was saying before, but these different versions that they adopt and manipulate depending on what they want to convey.
My next question is based on this one. It's an observation and a question, and I guess it's a question first to Jose and maybe to Armen, if you wanna comment on that, because we're getting into two possible literary universes here. And it's getting back to the horizontal and vertical growth a bit. So the question is a linear, vector-like process of the past, the way we are talking about it now, is the only model of literary history development? Well, of course, it's a loaded question, because to me, the literary process defined in these terms feels a bit stiff, and pun intended, because I hope that we are now expanding the literary process horizontally, and that, to quote Joyce, in the future, the sister of the past, we may see ourselves in a differently shaped literary space that would be devoid of the literary Oedipal complex and the dictatorship of the tradition. And Armen, you in, I believe, your second or third chapter, or couple of times, do mention that history is not a linear process, and that the thought doesn't work in a linear way. It's a cyclical process. And so, Jose, would you comment on that?
Sure. I'll say a few words anyway. I think, yes. So the book kind of presents two views or two possibilities of how to organize or to think about this tradition. There's the 5 main case studies, the 5 main chapters, which do look chronologically at the phenomenon of Joyce in Russia, going from the 20s to 2005 roughly, and seeing how it's developed over time, linearly, vectorially, I'm not sure. And then the conclusion, what's different there, it's a 5-part conclusion, and for the fourth part, I interviewed a number of contemporary writers and readers and critics of Joyce, including Alexei. So thanks again, spasiba. And there, I think of it as a different way of presenting this material or conceptualizing the Joyce story, the Joyce in Russia story, right? So it's a mix of voices, a kind of polyphony of perspectives that's not rooted in any single linear trajectory. Instead, it's this kind of clash at times and synchrony, overlap in opinions that happen just by chance. I interviewed all these writers separately, asking similar questions, to some extent. But to me, it was fascinating to see how they would overlap and be different. And then also how some of these conversations and debates about Joyce and whether Joyce is really special or anything new in 2019 to 2021 echo the same debates that were happening in the 1920s and 1930s. So there we even have a kind of cyclical approach to Joyce in Russia. Yeah, so there's, I don't know, different ways of organizing the material in this book. Anyway, I was presenting 2 options. I would also, I'd be curious to hear from Tim Langen at some point later in the audience Q&A, who's here with us, of this idea of reading backwards and reverse plagiarism and how that can take place, maybe with Joyce as well.
Armen, would you like to comment on that as well, please?
Yeah, I had a chance to look at that part of the book about what Jose just was talking, and it's really fascinating in his book how these voices from the different times from different eras are mixing and speaking with each other. And I think that this is a very Joycean thing, because really cyclical models were very important for him. And not only history is cyclical, but life and death as well. And well, his last work is very much about this eternal cycle of history of humanity, Finnegan's Wake. So I find it fascinating how this cyclical model works in one of the chapters of Jose's book. And at the same time, maybe this would sound stupid, but I think that a process can be horizontal, or let's say in the order of appearance, and cyclical at the same time. Because Alesha, Nabokov, Shishkin, all those great writers, they might be mentioned just in the horizontal perspective in time, but at the same time they represent times that are so far one from another that I believe that you can call this whole cycle of Russian perception of Joyce that starts at one point in the 20th, and that is not going this direction to the 20th of the 21st century, but is going all the way around to come to the point where, as Jose just said, people are having the same debate about Joyce that they used to have 100 years ago.
Thank you, Armen. Brilliant. And bringing this question to Alexei as well, I'm going to rephrase it, so just like moving on. Алексей, вопрос к вам. Ваше восприятие Джойса и, возможно, ваше творчество и те приемы, которые вы используете в ваших книгах, когда вы пишете, когда вы думаете об исторических процессах. Может быть, это прозвучит несколько топорно, простите, но идет ли этот творческий процесс в одной плоскости, как бы горизонтально, или это циклический для вас процесс, или это еще какая-то другая геометрическая форма, или что-то вообще другое, что вы используете?
Ну, вообще, если мы все-таки обратимся, опять же, к нашей теме, то есть к Джойсу, вот, то мы поймем, что он прервал традицию эпоса, да, и восприятие времени как некой циклической структуры, и внезапно сделал замечательную вещь в Улиссе. Он при всем том движении, которое происходит в книге, это история об Одиссее, который вернулся, по сути дела, и просто не знает, что делать, и не совсем понимает, как он здесь оказался.
Along the same lines, I asked this question to Alexei, and he wants to get back to the subject of our talk, which is Joyce, who in Ulysses reinvented the timeline, and his book is basically about Ulysses, who came back home after going on his journey and doesn't know what to do.
И мне кажется, как Джойс зародил эту традицию, вот этот ретроспективный взгляд на жизнь, так им, по сути дела, и пользуется весь 20 век и начало 21 века. То есть доводят героя до конечной некой точки, или он уже заранее в ней оказывается изначально, и он как бы ретроспективно, это ретроспективный взгляд.
So Joyce reintroduced the cyclical view on history, and basically what everybody's been doing after him in the 20th and now 21st century is using this retrospective view on the hero's journey, whether he was already there in the first place or he found himself there returning from the journey, and it's a look back at what happened.
И в частности, я здесь не оригинал. Вот.
So Alexei says, I'm not original here. And moving cyclically to our next question with our speakers and with Joyce, let's talk a bit about history, which is another cornerstone of José's book and Joyce's book and the book of all the authors that we are discussing here. So I'm going to quote José here again. The clash of the artist with the history far beyond individual comprehension lies at the heart of this book. So it's the clash of the artist with the history, and here comes the famous quote, you know, the history is the nightmare that I'm trying to wake up from, and as well as the question of whether or not one may change one's history, and if so, how artistic creation fits into this equation. And I have to say that as a writer, as an artist, I feel this is one of the most important questions. Can one person change history? What moves history? What moves people? You know, the Tolstoyan War and Peace epilogue question, right? So Jose writes, Stephen Dedalus calms his personal and cultural pasts for the material that can be used in art. He constantly pushes back against the wave of history that tyrannizes him in its various guises. His mother and her death, English cultural dominance, exclusion from Dublin's literati, his father, and so forth. He's able to redefine the past, and so do the Russian authors in exile, while the Soviet authors seem to fail to do so. Did I get this part right, Jose? That those who stayed in the West are kind of on Stephen Dedalus' page, redefining their identity through connecting to the chosen father figure, and those who stay in the Soviet Union are the prisoners of history and can't break against it. Or did I get it wrong? What do you think?
Yes and no, I suppose, or both. I think for the first author, Alyosha, that's very much the case, right? That this novel ends with not the yes of Ulysses at the end. Yes, I said yes, I will, yes. A kind of proclamation of love, an affirmation of life, kind of path forward for Bloom and Molly, as well as for Stephen, who heads out into the dark to make his own way in the preceding chapter. Alyosha's novel ends with this Uraz, hurrah at the end, with his three heroes in a bed, kind of menage a trois thing, where no one's really happy, no one feels able to do what they want to do. There's all the pressures from the society that's being constructed around them that they can't integrate successfully into, at least those characters. So for him, yes, I think this is a recognition that that path, Stephen's path, Joyce's path, is now impossible or becoming impossible where he's writing from, and history is going in a direction that he can't keep up with. And Alyosha, of course, stopped publishing and writing the sorts of things that he was writing at this time. His production fell in a number of ways. Nabokov, as I write in the book, I think faced this challenge head on of losing one's course in emigration, but ultimately this book is, like Ulysses, a celebration of life, celebration of the gift of art to transcend and to escape one's conditions in reality. And he's taking that from Joyce. He's taking the da, this yes at the end of Ulysses, and incorporating it into Dar, the gift, the novel that I look at in chapter 2, the main one, his final Russian novel. So they're linked in this way. And for him, even if history can be a burden, if not a nightmare, if you can lose your father in an assassination, botched assassination, if you have to go into emigration, nonetheless, as he writes, you can use the magic carpet of art to transcend time, to transcend history. So it's not the same sort of bound and restrictive force that is all around us. And then just to wrap up, I think with the later writers, Sokolov and Bitov, who did remain in the Soviet Union, at least Sokolov when he was writing School for Fools, the novel I look at in chapter 4, they're faced with the similar pressures as Alyosha, if in a different form by this time, 60s and 70s. But I'm not suggesting that they fail. I'm suggesting that they find a new way out, as we have been saying and hearing today, that they're able to reformulate the equation, reformulate their attitude and approach to history. And this comes through in the text themselves and how they build the text as something that's not hierarchical, kind of traditional in any sort of way, more open-ended. And I think this open-endedness is something that they were needing, I suppose, and attracted to in the Soviet Union, reflects both their attitude to history as well as to looking for new forms in literature. It kind of merges and addresses this issue that you raised.
My last question to you, and there will be many questions unanswered just because there are just way too many good things to ask, but you'll have to read the book, is about the chapter on Bitov, because to me, it felt like one of the most felt through chapter somehow. The one on Nabokov is fascinating, and I definitely recommend it, and I recommend reading it in parallel with Nabokov and Ulysses. It's a mind-blowing journey. But with Bitov, who takes on Joyce, his texts and his ideas in Pushkin House as part of his efforts to discover a means out of his belatedness. It's a dilemma central to his generation, as you write, and perhaps not just his, perhaps to all the other generations that of the Russian writers and readers who came after that. You write that Pushkin House is not only an intertextual novel, but a novel about intertextuality. And the protagonist, Lova, struggles with the phantoms of his culture's past and his ties to his family, while in what might be termed a Russian response to Harold Bloom, the author narrator realizes he need not raise the monuments of the past to achieve his own greatness, nor does he need to equate himself with them. Bitov shows through Lova's story that this conception of hierarchies is no longer applicable in his time. Time has been disrupted by the Soviet cultural and political takeover. And in place of rebellion, what remains for Lova instead is servitude as links to the past that have been shattered. And he suspects that he can never catch up, let alone truly understand their past. So this theme of literary fatherhood is overwhelming in Pushkin House. And he writes, Lova says, you know, Bitov through Lova says, time itself was father, papa, cult. What other synonyms are there? And it really resonated with me, and it seemed like it created this bridge between Alesha and Nabokov's chapters into the later writers, into Sokolov and Shishkin. So can you comment on this Bitov's chapter a bit, Jose?
Sure. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, so I'm glad you did, and you see this as a kind of transition chapter. I think that's absolutely right. That we're moving from the modernist model to something new, certainly, in Bitov, who's responding to the past to modernism, to these phantoms, Joyce and Nabokov and others, and starting to experiment more with the form or new ways, novel ways. So in this chapter, what I'm looking at is Pushkin House, Pushkinsky Dom, Bitov's masterpiece, his main novel, where, as I said, the main character is just obsessed with finding out where he comes from, his roots, and he comes face to face with the kind of ghosts of the past in the form of his father, who's returned from the camps, so he's been suppressed. A lot of art that he would like to know has been suppressed, and it all becomes kind of intertwined for him. Everything that he's lost, both personally and artistically, creatively, it hasn't been available to him, and all of a sudden he finds it again and becomes available. It's also part of the novel is set around the time of Stalin's death, and in that quote you read, time itself was father, papa cult. We have Stalin kind of hidden in the background, and as this figure, a father, quote unquote, figure, who's complicated everything for Bitov's generation, and he's trying to figure out how to relate to the past in a productive way that doesn't lead to the resignation of Alyosha, that doesn't lead to simply repeating the past and repeating oneself. This attempt to say something new. And so what was most useful, I think, or most productive for me in reading the novel alongside Joyce or with Joyce here was this critic Patricia Yeager and her idea of a kind of queer intertextuality that isn't hierarchical, that's not the Bloomian kind of Oedipal conflict with the past, but rather this kind of, she uses a metaphor of writers kind of taking bits of clothing from other writers' works and trying them on. And so for me, Pushkin House is this. It's not so much a person putting clothes on, but a house that he's decorating with elements of the past, Joyce being one of the main ones here, and how he puts it together, how he decorates the space, so to speak, kind of points to his relationship and his attitude to Joyce. And, you know, all specific images that he derives from Joyce, the feet that you mentioned at the beginning, the shoe wear, this Jewish figure. There's all these kind of more specific and more, I don't know, smaller elements from Joyce that he's pulling out into Pushkin House.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was quite brilliant that you followed the small details. You know, in every chapter you found the shoes, the feet, the keys, and the motifs, and seeing how every author is echoing that. It just probably resonates and goes through the different texts, which is the definition of intertextuality. So from here, I think it would be a great transition and the answer to Alexei now, and then follow with the question to Armen. So Alexei, I first will say it in English and then in Russian. Many critics compare your Petrovы in Flew to Ulysses. Do you see the connections, and how do you feel about these comparisons?
Да, конечно, есть, да, есть, это безусловно, вот, я паразитирую на предшественниках литературных, само собой, как бы, это даже не обсуждается. Вот.
Let me translate. So the answer was enthusiastically yes, 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 of course, unconditionally, and it's Alexei's words, not mine. I'm being a parasite. I'm parasiting off my predecessors, and that the critics are right.
В этом и есть, собственно, литературная работа, чтобы обкрадывать тех, кто писал до этого, и как бы встраивать в настоящее, что ли. Вот.
It is the actual real literary work to steal from the others and bring it into your own work, so it comes out. Алексей, может быть, тогда вы, наверняка у вас есть свой Джойс, своя трактовка Улисса. Может быть, вы просто расскажете так в свободном полете, а я переведу то, что вам хочется сказать.
Ну, я попытаюсь. Знаете, что мне нравится все-таки в Джойсе, конкретно в Улиссе?
Alexei will just speak about his Joyce and his take on Ulysses. And you know what I really love about Ulysses, says Alexei.
Мне очень симпатично в Улиссе то, что он не, что Джойс в этом романе не цепляется к каким-то крупным историческим событиям, скажем так, а не пытается зацепиться за крупные исторические события, а развертывает частную человеческую жизнь до вот этой как раз-таки до эпической истории. Вот. По крайней мере, в масштабах книги.
What appeals to me, says Alexei, in Ulysses, that Joyce doesn't hang up on some major epic events in human history. He is developing smaller everyday events until they reach the epic proportion.
Потому что очень легко И это подтверждается историей российской литературы.
Because it's easy, and it has been confirmed by the history of Russian literature that
Когда у нас множество романов строится на том, что главный герой или герои проходят через определенные вехи. Вот, там коллективизацию, репрессии, лагеря, войну, смерть Сталина, оттепель, потом опять завинчивание гаек и перестройку. Это уже для читателя это просто уже чудовищно.
so what is common for the Russian literature, modern Russian literature, is that the characters are going through certain historical milestones, such as collectivization and great purges, Stalinism, the war, the thaw after Stalin's death, and so forth, the major moment of Soviet history. And for a reader, that's becoming quite monstrous at this point.
За этим как-то теряется, как сказать, одна из функций литературы сравнительная, то есть попытка сравнить чувства тех людей, которые были за 100 лет до тебя, за 200, за 300, с теми же ощущениями, что присутствуют сейчас, и с какими-то вот вроде бы незначительными деталями обычной жизни. Вот.
One of the main functions and goals of literature is comparative. It's to compare the feelings, the emotions of a person who lived 200, 300 years ago to the feelings and emotions of a person of our contemporaries.
Мне кажется, что все-таки наиболее хорошие романы — это те, где несколько дней развернуты до романа, нежели когда там 70 лет запиханы в 400 страниц, упакованы. Вот.
And my feeling, says Alexei, is that the best novels are those that cover few days worth of events, 3-4 days, rather than 70 years that develop for 400 pages. Спасибо, спасибо. Now with that question and developing on it, Armen, so like I said, I listened to several of your podcasts, and you bring up many of history themes, as well as again these good words in Russian, bogobорчество and rebellion. And would you just choose several themes of what is important to you in Ulysses, and what would you like to highlight in the frame of our discussion today?
There are so many things I want to comment from the previous discussion, because it's so interesting to listen to you. First of all, when you spoke with Jose about this trap of the Soviet literature and Ulysses, it's quite comprehensive and but interesting topic. And I just wanted to mention that 3 out of 5 writers that are not mentioned, but those who are in focus of Jose's book, they ended up living abroad. They ended up living in the West. So Mikhail Shishkin, who's living in Switzerland, if I'm not confusing it, then Sokolov in Canada, and Nabokov, who had to leave Russia as well. So I don't think that there is a way to make friends the Russian Soviet ideology and Joyce. And that's why I believe so many attempts of translating Joyce into Russian failed, and Russians could only read Joyce in their own language during the perestroika. Then when Alexei spoke about Joyce, I just wanted to say that I agree so much with this idea that what is fascinating about Joyce and Ulysses in particular is that he focuses his attention on so little tiny things. And I remembered a quote from Gary Saul Morrison, American professor, who once said, what makes a book great literature is when you don't need to know the historical context. And there are so many clues, so many details of the history of the moment in Ulysses that you need to know to appreciate the book. But at the same time, you can read it and appreciate it 100 years later without knowing anything in particular about those circumstances of Irish history, of Dublin's life, without knowing who those people were in Joyce's life, etc., etc. So this, as Alexei said, I think is something that a lot of us love in Joyce. When it comes to me, I wanted to, well, I think that one thing that I think is important to mention is the absence today in our discussion of Russian translator of Ulysses, Sergei Sergeyevich Kharuzhy, who passed away last year, because this discussion is taking place nowadays. Discussions like this are taking place nowadays in Russia as well, because we have the translation. Because I know that during Joyce project that we launched this year, there were a few thousand people who read Ulysses for the first time, but just few of them read it in original English, because it's well, it's immensely hard for the native speakers, as far as I understand as well. But for a person, when you just learned English in school, it's almost impossible to read Ulysses in English. So that's great when you have a good translation, a translation that reveals the text. So for me, returning to the question of what Joyce is, what role this novel and this author played in our life, in my life, in this particular moment, I would say that he shaped a lot my view of literature. Sorry, and at the same time, what I believe is important, and let's say a lesson of Joyce, is that at some point you can make the so-called inversion of form and content, and literature can work that way, because the latest chapters of Ulysses, it's just a triumph of form, and form at some point, in my view, is beating the content. And the form is much more important than language. The way the text is organized, the internal structures of the text are at some point more important to Joyce than the content of the work. He always has the content in mind. He never loses any detail, etc., etc. But form is the priority, and which is fascinating in my view, is how he rearranged Circe, the 15th episode, for around 9 times, rewriting this chapter during few months. And after that, he had to rearrange some other parts of the book to adapt them to the arrangement he made in Circe, even the parts that were already published a few years ago in the literary. So his content, his constant work on each detail, on the structures, on the form of literature, I believe is most important for me, because it just shows you the attitude that one can has towards literature, and can work, because each chapter of Ulysses can be a discovery for a whole book of yours that you can write I believe that's all for now. Thank you. That was long.
No, that was perfect. And that actually connects us to what Jose and Alexei was saying, because Alexei in the very beginning said that he discovered Joyce the rule of language, the reign of language of literature and life. So that's what you're saying. And then in the chapter on Olesha and the Soviet literature, of course, the Soviet critics claim that we should protest and fight the formalism and naturalism, and that's exactly what did not agree with the, Soviet realism, social realism. And so here, we can continue this discussion. Armen has this beautifully done pieces in Russian. So for those of you who speaks Russian, I really recommend it. And let's open the discussion to our audience who's been very patiently waiting and listening.
This is all extremely fascinating to me. And I think a lot of what all of your guests have talked about is, or at least an important part is one's relation to predecessors and to history, and whether those relations can be rethought, whether they are imprisoning or whether they can be enriching. And it strikes me that in the immediate past, in the Russian context, this was also a very important question for, say, the symbolists and the acmeists and the futurists, who all took different views, but I would say all very charged towards these questions, whether history is cyclical, whether one should cast away one's predecessors. So my question is just whether this is an important context or counterpoint for the Russian and Soviet reception of Joyce. Is it Joyce alongside these other people interested in similar questions? Is it Joyce, just a fresh voice? This is what I'm wondering.
Jose?
Sure, I can go first. I think it's a number of those things. What I do mention in the book, right, is at some point that Joyce is not unique in this regard, or he's part of these conversations that you're referring to, right? The theme of fathers and children, fathers and sons, is not new to Russian literature through Joyce. It's there probably from the beginning, but certainly with Turgenev, futurists and their war against the past, in the search for something new. What I think Joyce brought that appealed to a number of these writers are the sorts of things that we've been talking about and that Armen highlighted for us just now, right? That the way he integrated or reconfigured the lines between form and content provided something new to them, to these writers, certainly the ones that I look at in the book. And alongside all of that, if the content is about paternity and lineage, and you can say something new about it through this revolutionary form in literature, then all the better. So I think it was kind of both that appealed to them. Yeah, again, I don't think they were unaware or not engaging with the kind of broader context that you're referring to, these other groups or other writers that were interested in similar questions. And this is totally tangential, but I just find it so curious that Joyce actually had some connection. I think I've told you this before, Tim, but I'll share it with everyone else. He had a connection with one of Khlebnikov, Vladimir Khlebnikov's cousins. So this is this curious connection between Russian futurism and Joyce. The connection appears in Ulysses as well.
Armin, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I can just, I want to agree with Jose and what he said. And I could add the contemporary perspective of the nowadays readers in Russia of Joyce, if it's something new for Russian readers or it's something that we are familiar with. For those readers who are now in their 30s, let's say, Joyce is, let's say, unknown to our parents' author. So if you are not from a family that was from the Russian intelligentsia, let's say, those who were familiar with Western literature that was not official in the Soviet Union, in that case, we are the generation of those people who rediscovered Joyce and his ideas because this is not something familiar to our parents. And I believe that this perspective is also interesting, like for a whole generation, not for everyone, of course, but for many of those Russians who are in their 30s now, Joyce might be rediscovered as an author who just finished his book and you read him for the first time. It's not like with Hemingway or Salinger that were well known in the Soviet Union, and when you read it, well, you read something that your parents read, and you discover ideas, forums, etc., that your parents discovered before you. And in Russia, particularly, because Joyce was not officially part of Soviet canon of Western literature, and there was no full translation. For many people, the generations now read them for the first time, or they read him for the first time in the 90s. So I think that might be an interesting look at this topic.
I don't really have a question as much as I want to comment on Sasha Sokolov's School for Fools. I think I don't think he really was very much interested in his predecessors. I mean, there is definitely a conflict between the young and the old, but it's like he's like describes a puer aeternus type of figure in the hero of School for Fools. And the whole world, I think, around him represents his shadow, the Senex, which is also the father figure, but it's also the Soviet system. And in a sense, it's kind of a stance that the author and the hero take in coping with the Soviet system. It's kind of a stance of internal exile, where you refuse to become a part of the world, you refuse to become conscious. So his hero is like this perpetual puer aeternus who refuses to be conscious, he's not a part of any world, and this it's sort of a self-perpetuating internal exile. So, but I do have a question. Do you believe that Anna Akhmatova actually read Ulysses either once or twice, as she claims?
She claimed 6 times, right?
6 times, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
Yeah. She didn't understand it until the 6th time.
Oh, I thought it was 2.
At least she, admits to how tough it was. I thank you for your comment and the question too. And I definitely think that's the case with Sokolov, that's part of what my first chapter gets at too, that there's a focus, fascination, engagement with paternity in the terms that you're describing, but there's this exchange between the hero, student so-and-so, and Nymphea, and his teacher, and in that exchange, it kind of becomes clear. It's suggested that through the student, that one need not go through all this trouble, this kind of literary crucible to become a successful writer. And I take that as a kind of broader statement, like you're saying, that you kind of pull away and don't engage with the political world. You just focus on your art, focus on your world and your imagination. So yeah, I agree. I think that's a really great observation. Akhmatova, I don't know. I don't have, a reason to doubt her, I suppose. She did have, this epigraph originally for Requiem, the poetic cycle, Requiem, where she misquotes Ulysses, that you cannot leave your mother an orphan. So she read it enough, I suppose, to know the quote and to engage with it thematically. I gave a paper reading Requiem and Mandelstam, his verses to the Unknown Soldier, together with Joyce, because they read Ulysses together, according to Akhmatova and Zhukovskaya. So I definitely think there's something there, and that's the kind of phantom zone, this moment between the 30s and 50s, 60s, when things kind of opened up again for Joyce in Russia, where people were still talking or reading Joyce, even if it was much more limited. So yeah, I think, the influence on poetry and Mandelstam and Akhmatova and to the contemporary age is something that I'm still very much interested in and want to dig into a little bit more. Do you believe that she didn't read it?
I don't know. I somehow have my doubts. I mean, if she read it, I think she read it really, really critically. It was more like, I don't know. I think she was sort of contentious about it. I don't know. Thank you.
She also, or Zhukovskaya anyway, in her diaries, references how she shared Dubliners and some of the other works with Akhmatova, and Akhmatova appreciated the kind of connections across Joyce's world, his kind of Joycean cinematic universe, Joycean literary universe, that characters can appear in these different places. And that's what she was doing with her work to some extent. So she at least expressed some other familiarity with Joyce.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Tanya, for an excellent question and comment.
When you were talking about history going in both directions, I was reminded of Shishkin wrote an essay on Joyce, and which appeared in Russian, but I translated it, but I believe it has not been found a home in English. And he says, the end that is the beginning, everything passes, but not before everything begins. And Ouroboros, a line as long as the novel that bites its own tail. No, that's wrong. The Ouroboros doesn't bite its own tail, it disgorges itself, births itself through its mouth, as the mouth does the word, thereby changing the course of the universe. And all human culture gets turned around. Finnegan's Wake gives birth to the Torah.
Yeah, I remember he shared this with me in your translation too. I think around the time it was appearing, because it was first in German, I think. And I remember he said that he didn't, like it says here, no, that's wrong. He didn't make the connection to the Ouroboros initially, but it's perfect. And as I refer to it in my book, this essay, More Than Joyce, Bolshevik Joyce, is really like a Rosetta Stone to my reading of Shishkin and his take on Joyce. Lays out a biography of Joyce, but also how Shishkin thinks of Joyce's art and what he has pulled from it and why he values it so much. So it's so valuable to me as a kind of meta commentary on Shishkin and Joyce.
Well, thank you for an excellent commentary, Marian. I have a question that Dimitri sent for Alexei, so I'm going to say it first in English and then in Russian. If you have read it in Russian translation or in English first, or have you tried reading it in English, and what do you think of translation?
А я только в русском переводе читал у Лиса. Правда, с массой комментариев, поэтому я не могу сравнивать. Вот. Мой уровень чтения на английском не настолько велик, чтобы как бы вот в оригинале это все делать. Вот.
Alexis says that he read it in Russian translation with a lot of commentaries, but he couldn't compare it to the original. Но вот часть вопроса была, то есть как вы оцениваете этот перевод? Считаете ли, что он переведен на русский хорошо?
Ну, мне показалось, да.
So the
Ну, не
question...
было ощущения, что читаю что урезанную какую-то версию, чего-то. Вот.
So the question was whether Alexei believes that it was translated well, and he believes that it was a good job because there was not a sense of reading something that was abbreviated.
Because I read both in Russian translation for the first time, of course, and in English as well. And I also read, working on my project, I read another Russian translations that were made later than the first canonic, let's say, translation of Hinkes and Kharuzhi. And I also read in Spanish, in different Spanish translations, parts of the book, and because I'm interpreter of Spanish, and I speak the language, and I compared with some parts of other translations. So in my view, the first Russian translation of Hinkes and Kharuzhi is a very decent book. It's a very decent translation, and I believe that it reveals the techniques of Joyce, his style, and what is most important, the atmosphere, the technical devices. So the translators tried to keep as much Joyce as is possible. It's always difficult to translate any book in any language, and it's much more difficult with Joyce, of course. But in my view, and from my opinion, the Russian translation of Ulysses that we have is very, very good, and we're lucky to have it.
Great. Yeah, I admire anybody who would even think of translating Ulysses, and it's certainly a very courageous act. And we have to thank the translators for taking upon it. We have a couple more questions from YouTube audience. Thank you for that. Denise Novikov is asking Jose, why did you choose these particular Russian writers?
Thank you. I think that's a good question. And before I answer that, I did just want to mention, because it's such a, I don't know, important thing and fascinating. There's a recent translation of Finnegan's Wake. It's still in progress as far as I understand. So if you read Russian, it's available online, openly, by Andrei Rene, and published. You can get, physical copies as well, each chapter, to a little volume, but we'll have a Russian Finnegan's Wake eventually. Why these 5 authors? I think for a number of reasons. One, they all commented on Joyce explicitly, so I had the benefit of the kind of, again, meta commentary or paratext that could supplement the readings of these works. Second, I think they all kind of create, outside of Joyce, a nice lineage or tradition. They're all writers that kind of refer to each other, that are obviously building on what their predecessors had done. Even Nabokov complimented Alyosha, despite his being a Soviet writer technically. And the later writers, Sokolov and Shishkin, all reference Nabokov and Alyosha too. And Joyce, of course. So there's those kinds of reasons. Some of it, I think, was also just fortuitous, as the starting point of the book was Alyosha, as I may have mentioned. When I was rereading Ulysses, I was struck by these parallels to Ulysses. The bathroom scenes that it opens with, again, the closing scene on the bed, certain images that are clearly linked to each other, the way Babikov in Envy meets Kavalier, the hero, on the street after a drunken brawl, kind of a drunken fight of some sort. It seems to me a clear parallel with Bloom, one of Bloom's encounters in Ulysses with Stephen after he gets really drunk and gets hit by the English soldier. So there's these particular details that struck me as very Joycean and worth exploring further. And again, Pushkin House explicitly mentions Joyce, so it just seemed like a natural fit. I became curious as to why Bitov was referencing Joyce by name, in his works by name, and who Joyce was in his imagination. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. There's a mix of different factors. And then I also wanted to look at his response in prose, and in particular in these novels, and kind of viewing these novels as a, I don't know, space, an experimental space to work through these issues of paternity and lineage and history, as they do in these 6 novels at least.
Well, thank you, Jose. We have another comment here from Anastasia Morozova on second and Armen on the translation, and Alexei as well. Anastasia read Ulysses both in the original and the iconic Russian translation, and the latter is indeed quite good. There's also a good question from Anastasia Morozova on YouTube. Having written Envy, having written Envy or Zavist in 1927, do you think Alyosha had read anything of Ulysses, or other things common in their works are random coincidences, or maybe it was something in the literary air that both felt, Jose?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, Joyce was definitely being discussed early in the Soviet Union in the latter half of the 20s into the 30s. One of the first references to Joyce was published, it was incorporated in an article by Evgeny Zamyatin, who wrote We, in the early 20s. So he was kind of introducing Joyce to the kind of writers and the kind of crowd that Alyosha was part of. But most significantly, I learned early on when I was, finding these connections between Envy and Ulysses, that the first, again, partial translation of Ulysses was made or published at least in 1925 in Moscow and in Leningrad. So it's not, the Haruji full version. It's not even what was published in the 30s, but it's bits of various episodes from Ulysses, some from the beginning, some from the middle, the more experimental chapters, and then even Molly's soliloquy, Penelope, at the end. So this translator, Zhytomyrsky, was really providing not a full sense, but a sampling of the different styles and a sampling of what Joyce was capable of and what he did in Ulysses to these early Soviet writers. So my sense, given the evidence and what Alyosha was saying too, or his involvement in these discussions, was that he, had access to this this initial translation. Well, and I should mention too, it's totally bizarre, but in this book, the Russian Odyssey of James Joyce by Yekaterina Genieva, the first author of the first Russian dissertation on Joyce, and she collaborated with Haruji or Hinkis, and did a lot for Joyce studies in Russia. She had this strange comment in there that we'll never know, or it's still unclear whether Alyosha in fact translated Joyce, whether in fact he translated Ulysses. I have no idea why she wrote this or what she was referring to, but it was just another one of these strange, I don't know, coincidences or Joycean moments that made me think that this was the topic to pick up and write about. But I haven't seen evidence that he translated Ulysses, unfortunately.
Yeah, I actually remember this part, and that is something to say about Jose's book, that it's written, sometimes it's funny, just the way the language goes. That part was funny, like out of nowhere with no evidence whatsoever, she says. I was just laughing when I was reading it. And it's a very enjoyable book to read. So it's, you know, sometimes, let's face it, some academic books can be dry. This book is the opposite of dry. It's fascinating. It carries you on. I read it in few days and I haven't finished yet just because I ran out of time. I was hectically reading, and I can't wait to read it because I found out so much for myself as a reader. I actually read pretty much every book on the list, some of them long time ago, some of them not so long time ago. And as a writer, I found some things for myself that were useful to me. And just as a human being, I mean, it was just altogether very delightful experience. And so was this talk today. And I want to thank everyone, first and foremost, Jose, who wrote the book and did all this tremendous work. And it's epic. I mean, it's a very ambitious project, and I think you did it really, really, really well. So congratulations. I can't wait for this book to be read widely. And many thanks to Alexei Salnikov, whom I hope to lure now that you know our program for maybe a Russian interview. I know that our readers would be fascinated. Алексей, я говорю, что я очень рада, что вы к нам присоединились.
Я как бы понял.
Разговор по-английски. Я надеюсь, наши читатели очень-очень были бы заинтересованы в интервью с вами по-русски, по вашим книгам. And so спасибо большое. And many thanks to Armen for his input. And I really enjoy your programs, and congratulations on an incredible project, so much needed. And just so that you know, for our audience, Armen has, I looked, 116,000 people subscribe to the channel, and some of the episodes were watched 20,000 times, which tells you something about Armen, about Joyce, and about the Russian audience and the love of book, something to be said for. So thank you so much for your time and involvement. And to our audience who stayed with us, thank you so much for choosing to spend your time, morning, day, or evening with us. So please subscribe to Globus Books channel. My goal is to bring it up to Armen's, not that we are competing. We are not in this, you know, circle of the competition here, but it would be nice to continue going and bring to you an interesting book, a fresh opinion, different angles. So thanks again. And the next show we are having is completely different. We are having an interview with Slava Zuckerman, the director of an iconic cult film Liquid Sky, which depicts the punks in New York in the 80s. Fascinating movie. Join us on November 13th. Stay safe. Thank you and bye.